Hi, this is Sarah Mikesell with the Pig Site, and today we're here with Christine McCracken. She is a senior animal protein analyst with Rabobank. Thanks for joining us, Christine.
Yeah, great to be with you.
Very good. And as people may see by the logos behind us, we're at World Pork Expo in Des Moines, Iowa. And we want to talk a little bit about kind of Rabobank's outlook on the U.S. Swine market or pork market. So let's start with the U.S. and let's talk a little bit about kind of profitability and economics. Obviously, this has been a tough 18 months or so. So let's kind of lead in with that. With what are some of your expectations? Are we getting better? Are we about the same? Or is there a grim outlook there?
Yeah, the good news is that it is getting better. It's been a really tough couple of years, as you mentioned, and we finally kind of gotten a better balance of supply and demand. So a little less pork maybe entering the market, and demand has been able to catch up. A lot of that driven by export demand, and that's really helped the market lift out of that really tough economic period that we went through. The other side of it, though, has been the cost. Improvements that we've seen, obviously, with feed costs coming down over 20%. It's obviously driven a nice rebound in profitability for our U.S. hog producers. For the most part, we turned profitable in this spring, and we think that'll continue all the way into the early fall. So great news, but still a lot of recovery, a lot of rebuilding of balance sheets that needs to happen over the next coming months.
Yeah, it's if you didn't have some money in the bank, you were probably a little bit in the red at this point, right?
Yeah, it was really, really tough for a lot of producers, especially if they didn't do a good job managing their risk or had some health challenges that were kind of outside the norm. Fortunately, I think a lot of guys made it through. This last cycle, we saw a lot less bloodshed maybe than we've seen in previous cycles, and that's good and bad, because typically what you see during the down cycle is that we do have some contraction of the sow herd, and it sets us up for a longer period of recovery. Without that, it might be a little tougher, through this next part of the cycle, absent any outsized demand improvement. So, on one hand, it's great that the industry maybe didn't suffer as much as they have in the past due to some better risk management or some better internal, operational efficiencies. But the reality is it might lead to a more challenging kind of outlook over the next several months.
Very good. And one of the things that you mentioned earlier was demand, pork demand. So let's talk about that as well as kind of maybe the impact of some of the other demand for other meats and how that's impacting pork.
Sure. You look at pork demand, and it's been a little softer than maybe we'd expected coming out of the last year. You think pork on the shelf, it's a great value. And the reality is that the U.S. consumer really just isn't going there today. And you have to ask yourself why that is. Obviously, we've put out some really helpful material for consumers. I think it comes down to a few things. People want convenient products, and pork isn't always hitting the mark there. So I think, the Pork Board and others are putting a lot of effort into finding ways to make that easier for consumers. And the other piece of it is that, a lot of our pork is kind of an ingredient, right? So we're looking at new ways to include it on the menu, whether that's as a topping, or as ground pork is finding a way into a lot of consumers' homes. So I do think there are ways to expand or broaden our universe and how we use pork, but the reality is it's been rough here in the U.S. and when we take a step back and look at the second half and really what our expectations are around demand, it comes back to there should be a lot less competing protein out there for us in the back half of this year, which, leads up to a pretty good outlook for pork consumption. So we think there's some reasons to be optimistic. There's going to be a lot less beef on the market. There's going to even be less chicken, we suspect, in the back half of the year tied to some production issues. And that should drive a much better environment for pork. But so far, it really hasn't turned out to be the case just yet.
Yeah, excellent. So let's also talk about the role that Canada and Mexico play here. If you could talk a little bit about what are the hot topics connected to kind of that North American play for those three countries?
Sure. It's really interesting to see how the market's evolved over the last several years. You think about Canada and Mexico being such important partners of the U.S. pork industry. Canada, we have a steady stream of wean pigs coming from Canada on a regular basis, and that feeds our industry, a critical part of the supply chain. And yet, they're reducing their sow herd in Canada, and that could restrict flows going forward. On the flip side, we've seen a lot of market hogs coming across the border as some of their packing capacity has shuttered. It's been tough there too. So we've had more market hogs coming into the U.S. That's put some pressure on our market. So there's a lot of kind of dynamics between the U.S. and Canada. We send a lot of pork to Canada. They like to send some here. So it's a good relationship. Mexico's a little different. Mexico's been the gold star, the champion of U.S. pork exports this year, a really important partner for the U.S. because the peso's been so strong and they love pork. We can send fresh pork to Mexico. It's a good value, so a really important partner for us. But as I mentioned, we've had an election in Mexico. We don't know how that relationship might look going forward. The peso has taken a hit lately, so there's a lot of things we don't know about how that relationship might look going forward. What we know, though, is that they are not self-sufficient in pork. They love pork, and we are probably the best value for them. So we think it'll remain an important partner. Whether or not it continues at the pace we saw in the first quarter, is anyone's guess. But as it stands today, it's still going to be an important partner for the U.S.
Right, and it's a cultural, not unlike China, right? Pork in Mexico, pork is a real cultural component to their foods, right? And they're getting together and all that.
No, it's a critical part of their diet, and so it's not as though they're going to move away from pork overnight. You look at chicken is also a good value for them, but they've had ongoing issues of avian influenza that have really limited and constrained their supply of chicken. So right now, pork is a good value, and it's top of mind for them. The other thing that's happening in Mexico that could make it a really strong case for increased pork consumption is just this onshoring of manufacturing in Mexico that continues to drive incomes and GDP growth in Mexico, and we think that's really positive for pork consumption as well. So some things to be excited about as we think longer term in Mexico, especially given how important pork is in their diet.
Very good. Excellent. Well, thanks so much for all the information today, Christine.
Sure. Great to be with you.
Thanks. This is Sarah Mikesell with the Pig Site.